Thank you all. And thank you to Vice Admiral Rogie for your kind introduction and for your leadership here at this storied institution. Will you join me in thanking him one more time for his hospitality and his extraordinary leadership? Members of the Cabinet, Congressman Babin, members of our armed forces, distinguished guests, and to the men and women of this storied institution dedicated to educating, developing, and inspiring America's national security leaders, it is my honor and my privilege to be here at the National Defense University. And it's also my great honor to be here today with the fourth meeting of the National Space Council. Join me in thanking all the members of our cabinet who have engaged so energetically in President Trump's vision for renewed American leadership in space. Can I ask all of them to stand? All the members of the National Space Council, you have our thanks. And to them and to all of you, I bring greetings this morning from our Commander-in-Chief, and a great champion of the armed forces of the United States of America, and a president who is committed to securing American leadership here on Earth and in the vast expanses of space. I bring greetings from the 45th President of the United States of America, President Donald Trump. In his inaugural address, the President declared that America stands, in his words, at the birth of a new millennium, ready to unlock the mysteries of space. And so we are. Since that day, our administration has worked tirelessly to extend our nation's proud legacy of leadership in the heavens. In just 16 months since relaunching the National Space Council, President Trump has signed 3 new space policy directives to rejuvenate our nation's space enterprise and reignite the spark of urgency that propelled America to the vanguard of space exploration a half-century ago. Under these new policies, NASA is preparing to send our astronauts back to the moon and to build the capacity to put Americans on the red sands of Mars. We're also modernizing out-of-date regulations to unleash America's trailblazing commercial space industry. And we're implementing a new space traffic management policy to protect our nation's vital assets in the congested orbital environment. But our Commander-in-Chief's highest priority is the safety and security of the American people. And while the last administration too often failed to meet the growing security threats in space, President Trump has stated forcefully a truth that the leaders of the National Defense University have long understood, that space is a warfighting domain just like the land, air, and sea, and America will be as dominant there as we are here on Earth. To meet the emerging threats on this new battlefield, to prepare America's best and bravest to deter and defeat a new generation of adversaries on that new horizon, we're creating a 6th branch of the United States Armed Forces. In June, the President directed the Department of Defense to begin the process necessary to establish a United States Space Force. This is the next and natural evolution of our armed forces, and it's absolutely necessary to ensure American supremacy in space. Since the dawn of the space age, the United States has recognized the vital importance of space to our national defense. Over the past 60 years, we've assembled the world's largest and most sophisticated constellation of surveillance, navigation, and communication satellites that increase the agility, precision, and lethality of America's armed forces. Today, I'm proud to report that there are tens of thousands of military personnel, civilians, and contractors operating and supporting our space systems, the eyes and the ears of America's warfighters around the world. These men and women serve with distinction across our defense and intelligence agency, and no organization has done more to advance American leadership in space than the United States Air Force. As General Salva knows, the airmen who run our nation's space programs are the best in the world. And since its earliest days as America's newest branch of the service, the Air Force has faithfully served as the steward of our nation's most vital assets, orbiting the Earth as well. But today, space is fundamentally different than it was a generation ago. What was once desolate and uncontested is increasingly crowded and confrontational. And today, other nations are seeking to disrupt our space-based systems and undermine our economic and military might as never before. For many years, nations from Russia and China to North Korea and Iran have pursued weapons to jam, blind, and disable our navigation and communication satellites through electronic attacks from the ground. But recently, our adversaries have been working to bring new weapons of war into space itself. From anti-satellite weapons and airborne lasers to highly threatening on-orbit activities and evasive hypersonic missiles, both China and Russia have been aggressively developing and deploying technologies that have transformed space into a warfighting domain. Since taking office, our administration has taken decisive action to strengthen American power and secure our vital national interests in space. President Trump signed the largest investment in our national defense since the days of Ronald Reagan, including renewed resources to enhance the resilience of our space defense systems, and we are grateful for the support of the Congress of the United States in providing these resources for America's defense. Through the new Launch Service Agreement awards, we're also strengthening our partnerships with private industry to grow our domestic launch systems and accelerate the delivery of new space and counter-space capabilities. And under the President's new national space strategy, our administration is uniting America's military, commercial, and civil space sectors as never before to ensure that the United States retains our rightful role as the world's preeminent spacefaring nation. But as President Trump has said, quote, "It's not enough to merely have an American presence in space, we must have American dominance in space." And that's exactly why, at President Trump's direction, we are taking steps to establish the United States Space Force as the sixth branch of our military that is separate from and equal to the 5 other branches. As the President and I believe, creating a Space Force is an idea whose time has come. As the men and women of the National Defense University know well, for decades, one independent study after another has called for reforms to the current organizational structure of our national space capabilities. In 1994, the General Accounting Office published a report highlighting what they described as the fragmented responsibilities over our national security space programs. It was widely read, but widely ignored. In 2001, the Rumsfeld Commission concluded, in their words, that the Department of Defense and the intelligence community are not yet arranged or focused to meet the national security space needs of the 21st century. 7 years later, the Allard Commission arrived at the very same conclusion, though its authors were more direct about it, bluntly stating, quote, "No one's in charge of America's security in space." And in July of 2016, the GAO published yet another report examining the dangerous fragmentation of responsibility over our national security space programs, which is spread across more than 60 different federal departments and agencies. This lack of centralized leadership and accountability, we believe, poses a clear and present threat to our capacity to advance our national security in space. It undermines our combatant commanders' ability to do their jobs. It puts our warfighters ultimately at risk as they operate on battlefields around the world. The American people will never accept this kind of vulnerability, and neither will we. So as we will focus here today in this meeting of the National Space Council, I believe the time has come to stop studying the problem and start fixing it. The United States Space Force, we believe, is central to the solution that America needs. In August, the Defense Department released a substantive report identifying concrete steps that our administration can take using existing authorities to implement the guidance of our Commander-in-Chief to begin to make the Space Force a reality. And for the past 2.5 months, our national security leaders have been hard at work to begin standing up the United States Department of the Space Force. I'd especially like to commend Deputy Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan and Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Paul Selva, for their outstanding efforts implementing the President's vision to stand up a Space Force. Thank you. Today, the National Space Council will vote to send 6 strategic recommendations to the President's desk, which will lay out our administration's vision and a roadmap, ultimately, for establishing a Space Force. First, we'll create a new unified combatant command, the United States Space Command, that will establish a dedicated chain of command for Space Force operations, ensure integration across the military, and develop the doctrine, tactics, and procedures of space warfighting in the 21st century. Next, the Secretary of Defense will create a new joint organization, the Space Development Agency, that will break free from ineffective bureaucratic structures and provide the men and women of the Space Force the cutting-edge warfighting capabilities that they need faster and more effectively. In addition to delivering the space warfighting technologies of the future faster than our adversaries will be able to keep up with, we also will ensure that our men and women in uniform can wield these capabilities unencumbered by bureaucracy. And under the leadership of our Commander-in-Chief, we've already removed unnecessary restraints on our commanders and given them rules of engagement they need to confront emerging threats on land and sea and in the air, and we will do the same in space. Toward that end, the National Space Council will work with the National Security Council to conduct a comprehensive review of current and future space operational authorities to ensure that our warfighters have the freedom and flexibility they need to deter and defeat any threat to our security in the rapidly evolving battlefield of space. Finally, and most importantly, our administration will work with leaders in Congress to create the United States Space Force as the 6th branch of our armed forces in the next National Defense Authorization Act. Under our constitutional system, only Congress can formally establish a new department of the military. Our administration, I'm pleased to report, is already working closely with leaders in the Congress in both parties on both sides of the Capitol building to chart a legislative and budgetary pathway to create a new department that will organize, train, and equip space forces, including both combat and service support functions for offensive and defensive operations. Very soon, with the support of the Congress, the Department of the United States Space Force will be a reality. I'm grateful to the leaders in the Congress for their engagement with us on this important initiative, and I especially want to thank Texas Congressman Brian Babin. He's been a great champion of American leadership in space, who's with us here today, and thank you, Congressman Babin, for your leadership on the United States Space Force. Early next year, in the President's budget, we'll call on the Congress to marshal the resources to stand up the United States Space Force. And in the months that follow, we'll work with congressional leaders to enact the statutory requirements in the NDAA to establish this new department by 2020. The time has come to write the next great chapter in the history of the armed forces of the United States, to turn the page to an evolution of our armed forces to meet the challenges and opportunities on that limitless frontier. Our nation's armed forces have always been the vanguard of advancing American leadership beyond the bounds of Earth. The Space Force will ensure a new era of American supremacy in space, but there's much work to do. As the men and women of the National Defense University know well, when it comes to defending our nation and protecting our way of life, it is the cost of inaction that we can't afford. With every passing year, what we choose to do in space plays an ever greater role in our security, our prosperity, and to no less extent, the very character and vitality of our nation. Our activities beyond our atmosphere accelerate scientific and medical discoveries. They spur groundbreaking innovations revolutionize how we communicate, travel, farm, and trade, launch new businesses and industries, and quite literally create the jobs of the future. And while other nations increasingly possess the capabilities to operate in space, not all of them share our commitment to freedom, to the rule of law, and to peace through strength. So as we continue to advance the prosperity of our people, expand the horizons of human knowledge, and carry our most cherished ideals into this new frontier, we will do this just as we have done through the long and storied history of this country. We will do it with a commitment to American strength and to freedom. In our earliest days as a nation, when American merchant ships came under attack by the Barbary pirates and were forced to pay, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, an enormous tribute to the petty tyrant of Algiers, we sent a squadron of our best Navy ships with names like Constellation, Enterprise, Constitution, and Intrepid to protect our commerce and defend our citizens' lives and liberty. When America's destiny beckoned us westward and generations of pioneers, homesteaders, traders, and entrepreneurs went to carve out a home in the wilderness, we dispatched regiments of the United States Army, frontier regulars, to explore new territories, protect vulnerable settlers, keep the peace, and help tame the Wild West. In the wake of the Second World War, with communism on the march around the globe, we forward deployed America's naval forces to deter our adversaries, reassure our allies, and keep the sea lanes open for the free flow of commerce. And we made the skies safe for travel and trade by creating the fifth branch of our armed forces, the United States Air Force. In our own day, in this still new century, to ensure that we continue to have unfettered access to operate freely in space, to lead in space for the benefit of the American people and all mankind, we will lead once again. We will evolve our armed forces, and we will create the United States Space Force to meet that future. As we take the first bold steps to strengthen our security, promote our prosperity, and advance American ideals in this infinite frontier, we'll do so with American strength, with that same pioneering spirit, and we'll do so as Americans have throughout our generations, with the faith of the American people, the same faith that generations of Americans have claimed on behalf of all of those who've taken to the skies in defense of freedom in ages past. We'll have faith in the capacity of our pioneers and risk takers to lead without regard to their own personal safety. They'll lead America into the infinite expanse of space, and our confidence will be in them and in all those that support them. And also, we'll also, I'm sure, breathe a word of prayer as those great pioneers go forward in this new endeavor of renewed American security in space, of renewed American exploration and leadership in space. I know many Americans will claim that ancient promise that when we rise on the wings of the dawn and we settle on the far side of the sea, even if we go up to the heavens, may there even his hand guide those who will lead us there, and even his hand hold them fast. With the efforts of the National Space Council, with the unwavering courage of America's men and women in uniform, the continued support and innovation of American people and American industry, and with the vision and the leadership of President Donald Trump, and with God's help, I know we will give America the security she deserves. We will forge a new era of peace through strength in outer space, and America will lead for freedom in that infinite frontier once again. Thank you. God bless you. God bless our armed forces, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you all for being here.
You cut the bolt. Don't cut the bolt.
Welcome to this fourth meeting of the National Space Council. Would you join me in thanking the members of the National Space Council and also our user advisory group who join us here today? We're very, very grateful for their efforts and their presence. I thank you all for your kind attention today and your presence here. And again, I want to thank the National War College here at the National Defense University for their warm hospitality and their willingness to accommodate. In these halls, generations of America's finest military leaders have studied and prepared to face and overcome the greatest challenges of their days. Join me in thanking the National Defense University once again for the job they do every day. In June, at our last meeting of the National Space Council, President Trump called for the establishment of the United States Space Force. And as the saying goes, back in Indiana, we didn't let the grass grow on this one. And I'm so grateful for the efforts of members of the Council and the User Advisory Group who put together the practical recommendations that we'll be forwarding to the President today. I'm going to ask a few members of the Council and the User Advisory Group to update us on the progress we've made to advance the President's priorities broadly. Let me begin by recognizing the Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao. Elaine?
Great. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. You and the President's commitment to expanding America's leadership in space is inspiring and so timely. The Space Council is meeting at the dawn of a new era in America's aerospace history, one that historians of the future may dub the rocket renaissance. You know, not so long ago, the aerospace community looked back wistfully on the previous era in space as the good old days. The Saturn V rocket, lunar landing, and the space shuttle seemed like achievements that would never again be equaled. And for 14 long years, the country that put the first man on the moon was no longer #1 in rocket launches. In fact, in 2011, when the last space shuttle was launched, not a single commercial satellite was put into space by an American rocket, not one. In 2012, 6 short years ago, the United States, was in 3rd place in commercial space launches. But that's changed, thanks to America's commercial space innovators and entrepreneurs. They have developed a variety of systems that revolutionized space launches and driven down the cost of space access. These technologies include air launch systems, small network satellite deployment, and most of all, fully reusable rockets. This wave of astonishing innovations has upended the commercial space sector. In 2017, our country finally regained its position as #1 with a record number of launches. And the good news is that we have broken last year's record with 35 licensed and permitted commercial space operations in fiscal year 2018. The global space economy is now valued at over nearly $400 billion a year. And American launch innovators, operators, and workers have captured a significant share of this market. The Department of Transportation is doing all we can to maintain this forward momentum. So let me share some pretty important updates. President Trump's second space policy directive tasked the department, as many of you know, to streamline and transform its commercial space transportation regulations. And the department is hard at work to implement this directive, including considering the option of requiring a single license for all types of commercial space flight launch and re-entry operations. And 2, replacing prescriptive requirements with performance-based criteria. I'm pleased to report that the department is on track to publish a transformational rulemaking. As we have discussed previously, the proposed rulemaking will provide a much-needed update to launch and re-entry licensing. And as per the President's and your direction, Mr. Vice President, it will consolidate and revise many launch and re-entry licensing requirements into a single regulation. And the rulemaking will streamline the licensing process while protecting public safety and national security. It will also enable flexible timeframes, redefine when launch begins, and allow the space industry to seek a single license to launch from multiple sites. The goal is, as Mr. Vice President, you have asked us to do, is to simplify the licensing process for launch and re-entry activity, enable novel operations, and reduce costs. The department was also asked to examine, in cooperation with other Space Council members, launch and re-entry requirements from federally owned launch ranges. This effort has benefited from the extraordinary support of stakeholders from the public and the private sectors. And this was especially true with the FAA's Aviation Rulemaking Committee. This committee is comprised of more than 40 individuals from across the commercial space and aviation sectors, and the committee's final report was instrumental in helping the department craft a proposal that will promote economic growth, maximize innovation, and minimize uncertainty for the private commercial space sector. Issues that you, Mr. Vice President, have told us that you care deeply about. So let me also thank our partners at the Department of Defense and also at NASA. They've given their time and expertise to this very important effort. This collaboration is and will continue to be critical in streamlining the requirements that apply to commercial space operations from federal launch sites. So, Mr. President, I look forward to continued collaboration with my colleagues on the National Space Council, and thank you for your guidance and direction to us, and that is my report. Thank you.
Great. Outstanding. Thank you, Secretary Chow. Thanks for your work on Policy Directive 2. It is part and parcel of vision for revitalizing American leadership in space, and your efforts will shape Americans' travel to and from space in the future and continue to drive industrial innovation and strengthen our shared industrial base for space leadership. So we thank you for that. Along the same lines with regard to policy directives 2 and 3, let's get a quick report from the Deputy Secretary of Commerce, Karen Dunn Kelly. Karen?
Thank you very much. Mr. Vice President, National Space Council, guests, thank you for allowing me to join you today. I send regrets from Secretary Ross, who is on an important overseas mission. Since this council last met in June, Secretary Ross has been very busy advocating for the U.S. commercial space industry around the world. He continues to emphasize our mantra, America must be the flag of choice for space commerce. In June, following last Space Council meeting, the Secretary testified to the House Sciences and Armed Services Committees, along with General Hyten and NASA Administrator Bridenstine, about the importance of President Trump's new space traffic management policy, the first of its kind. That testimony illustrated the great whole-of-government effort to address the risk created by space debris to valuable satellites, commercial industry, and potentially human lives. This past summer, Secretary Ross also debuted a space commerce segment to our Select USA Summit, which included 3,000 businesses and government leaders, thanks in part to Virgin Galactic and Lockheed, as well as others. Secretary Ross and his team have also been meeting with dozens of stakeholders to discuss the challenges they face, not the least of which is the burdensome regulation. Commerce is conducting a regulatory reform that will unshackle commerce space sector and unleash economic growth. We estimate that our efforts will help to grow the global space economy from its current present value of just under $400 billion to over $1 trillion. For example, last year, an interagency MOU established concrete deadlines and escalation procedures when timely resolution was not achieved. As a result, the department's Commercial Remote Sensing Office continues to shorten the licensing timeline. Today, the average time period for all remote sensing licenses is about 62 days, less than half of what it was in 2016 of 140 days, even as the number of licenses have increased. In 2010, there were only 26 licenses. Today, there are 227, and almost half of those licenses have been processed since 2017. The more streamlining, the less red tape leads to more business. I am also excited to announce that yesterday, in response to President's Space Policy Directive 2, the department submitted to the Office of Management and Budget a new draft rule that, if finalized, will revolutionize the way we regulate the use of cameras in space. This will replace outdated regulation that are slowing down industry achievements. The proposed new rule would establish categories for license applications that exempt certain pre-approved activities from the lengthy review process. It will allow federal government to focus its efforts and proposals on truly warranted national security attentions. In other words, the McLean High School CubeSat science project would probably not go through the same review process as a highly advanced sensing satellite. And SpaceX's GoPro camera that uses marketing and showing customers that the payloads have successfully been separated should not be treated the same way as the highly technical camera that can see your shoelaces from space. We look forward to working with OMB and our interagency colleagues to get the proposed rule finalized so that the public can comment. Next, I am pleased to report that last week, the department sent Capitol Hill a new legislative proposal, the Space Act. As directed by SPD 2, the proposal calls for creating a consolidated Bureau of Space Commerce to be led by a Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary. The agency will report directly to the Secretary, coordinating all the department's space efforts and supporting the department's larger mission of creating conditions for economic growth and opportunity. Included in the legislative proposal is a provision for mission authorization that will enable America to support a wide range of new space activities. To be clear, the proposal should not be mistaken as expanding government. It is just the opposite. Working with the Regulatory Reform Office, the Bureau will better coordinate, consolidate, and connect space functions across the department. The Bureau will serve as a much-needed storefront for industry within the government. As a priority of the department's strategic plan, advancing commercial space is a whole-of-department initiative. We have already begun to lay the framework and the foundation of the one-stop shop. Our new space team, representing all commerce offices and bureaus, meets at least weekly to collaborate on ways to advance the growing economy. Our ITA Advocacy Center has recorded 24 project wins for space companies across the globe valued at $4.3 billion, and has a pipeline right now of currently 21 activities which would be valued at a little over $2.8 billion. Even our grant-making agencies, such as the Minority Business Development Administration, awarded $400,000 to the Space Foundation to assist minority businesses. And EDA's Office of Innovation and Entrepreneurship solicits space commerce grant applications currently. Our Bureau of Industry and Security is actively engaged in the White House-led interagency discussions on export control reform. And NTIA is working on a holistic spectrum management policies that will advance the far-reaching missions envisioned by President Trump and Vice President Pence. Our reinvigorated Office of Space is open for business. Following the last council meeting, Kevin O'Connell joined the department in July as the new director. The position had been left vacant for over a decade. Not anymore. Welcome, Kevin. In fact, Kevin will be leaving this meeting a bit early as he needs to speak in Huntsville tonight on the very topic. Since the Council in June approved SPD 3 and its implementation plan, Commerce and the Department of Defense have been working very closely together. Our senior space officials have been spending time at the Vandenberg Air Force Base and in Colorado Springs to more deeply understand the Department of Defense's existing operations and capabilities. As the partnership, we will soon assemble a cadre of Commerce employees to work at Vandenberg as the civil agency interfacing with industry for space traffic management. We forged strong alliances with the Department of Defense, U.S. Air Force, U.S. Strategic Command, as well as other federal agency partners such as NASA, the State Department, the Department of Defense. We recently submitted our 90-day report for the Space Council, and we look forward to submitting a more detailed plan in December. We meet regularly with private industry, preparing to track, analyze, and safe coordination of space objects. We are already investigating ways to incorporate cloud computing and other advanced technologies into the open architecture data repository to showcase the innovations beneficial to the entire SSA-STM enterprise. Finally, I am proud to highlight the department's new space technologies, including the GOES satellite, that are improving NOAA's weather forecasting in an unprecedented way. Last month, Hurricane Florence's NOAA's 5-day hurricane track forecast accurately predicted the storm's landfall within 2 miles. That's not been done before. What this does is it enables state governors to more quickly declare emergencies, order evacuations, and truly save lives. The importance of space technology and space commerce in our lives has never been more evident than it is today. Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to speak about the department's progress.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much for your efforts, the Secretary's efforts. I think everyone looking on can see the energy with which the Department of Commerce has engaged this effort to streamline and to promote our commercial space industry, and the administrative actions that you've outlined, the legislation that you're promoting, all are reflective of the President's desire to unleash the full potential of our commercial private sector. So thank you very much. Well done. With that, let me recognize our NASA administrator and to say to Administrator Bridenstine, we appreciate your leadership at NASA. We were all thankful to see NASA astronaut Nick Hague return to the Earth safely, along with the Russian cosmonaut Alexei Uchinin. We noted the failed rocket launch 2 weeks ago. I know you were in Kazakhstan for that launch. We spoke contemporaneous with that, and I appreciate the attention that you paid to our astronaut and to the entire incident. It does strike me, Jim, as a wake-up call, and the need for us to once again be able to launch American astronauts on American rockets from American soil, and I know that day is rapidly approaching. With that, we look forward to your update on NASA's work with the Departments of Commerce and State, Transportation, and also the status of the International Space Station. Join me in welcoming the Administrator of NASA, Jim Bridenstine. Would you please?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Vice President. It was a tough week last week when we had a failed rocket launch. And as you correctly noted, Nick Hague and Alexei Ovchinin are home safe. and we are very grateful for that. Sir, I am also very grateful for your attention to the issue, your immediate care for the issue. Clearly, this is something that is important to you personally, and NASA recognizes that, and for that we are all very grateful. I will tell you this, while our astronaut and their cosmonaut are home safe, they are not happy. They want to be on the International Space Station, and they cannot wait to go again. So we're grateful for their enthusiasm. And NASA is regrouping, we're replanning, and we're getting ready to go again. We have a number of Russian Soyuz rocket launches in the next month and a half, and in December we're fully anticipating putting our crew on a Russian Soyuz rocket to launch to the International Space Station again. We have a really, really good idea of what the issue is. We are getting very close to understanding it even better so that we can confidently launch again. It is important to note that while this was a failed launch, it was probably the single most successful failed launch that we could have imagined. So for all of that, we are grateful. As far as NASA goes, sir, we are moving out rapidly on Space Policy Directive 1. We are going to the moon. We are going in a sustainable way. We are not going to leave flags and footprints and come home not to go back for another 50 years, but under your guidance and the President's Space Policy Directive 1, we are building a reusable and a sustainable architecture. Secretary Chow very clearly articulated what happens with reusable launch. The cost goes down and access goes up. Well, we envision an architecture between here and the moon that is entirely reusable, not just launch to low Earth orbit, but tugs from Earth orbit to lunar orbit, and of course, the reusable command module in orbit around the moon, we call it Gateway, and reusable landers that go back and forth from the Gateway to the surface of the moon. And landers not just with robots and rovers, but eventually humans in a sustainable architecture that takes advantage of our commercial partnerships and our international partnerships. Sir, 2 weeks ago, I was in Bremen, Germany for the International Astronautical Congress. I met with the heads of 24 different space agencies, and I had the opportunity to speak in front of international forums. And in each one, when I talked about the United States leading an international effort to get back to the moon, the response is overwhelming and it's spontaneous. People around the world have been waiting for the United States to get back to the moon and to lead a collaboration, much like we have done on the International Space Station, but to develop a much bigger and broader architecture to the moon, to retire risk, to prove technologies, to prove human physiology, and then take all of that architecture onto Mars. And I will tell you, in the international community, it was very, very well received. People love Space Policy Directive 1, and sir, it makes my job really easy on the international scene. So thank you for that. As it comes to the International Space Station and low Earth orbit, we are moving rapidly to commercialize low Earth orbit. It is in our interest as a nation for NASA in low Earth orbit and other orbital regimes, for NASA to be one customer of many customers, driving down our cost, increasing our access, and not just be one customer of many customers, but have numerous providers that are competing on cost and innovation in a regulatory framework that was articulated by Secretary Chow that enables us to do more than we've ever done before in low Earth orbit in a commercial way, and then we can use our resources to go where commercial industry is not yet ready. And of course, that's to the moon with this sustainable architecture. So, sir, we're moving out rapidly on these initiatives. Space Policy Directive 1 is kind of our bright, shiny object that we're going after. Space Policy Directive 2 on the regulatory frameworks, Space Policy Directive 3 on space situational awareness and space traffic management are all critical to our operations to accomplish these objectives. And it is also true that what we're talking about today, the Space Force, is critical to preserving all of these commercial and government capabilities for science, discovery, exploration, and of course, the betterment of humankind through commercial space activities. As you mentioned, sir, commerce requires security. When we came west, we needed to have security. When we do international trade, we have a Navy because we need security. And of course, this $383 billion industry that is in space is going to need security. The enemies of our country have identified space as the American Achilles heel, and we've got to make sure that they understand that they will receive no advantage from attempting to deny access to space for anybody in the world. And that would include civil space activities from NASA and NOAA, but also commercial space activities that the Commerce Department and the Transportation Department are so focused on. So that's an update, sir, and I'm honored to be here.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for that good report. Your energetic leadership is making a real difference at NASA, and I hope you will pass along our compliments to astronaut Nick Hague for being willing to get back on the horse. And,
yes, sir.
Go right back up before Christmas. A courageous man. 5 years in training. I'm sure he's anxious to get
To be clear, the mission before Christmas is not going to be Nick Hague, but he is anxious to get back there. So
yeah, I'll bet he'll be crowding to the front of the line.
You bet.
After talking with him. Great, well done. Thank you very much. Thanks for your leadership, and thank you for the way that NASA is working in such close consultation with our efforts in defense, our efforts in commercial space. It's making a real difference. With that, we're honored to be joined today by the chair of the Users Advisory Group, which the President appointed in connection with the National Space Council. It represents some of the leading experts on space, men and women of extraordinary background who are bringing their very best counsel to the work of this national space effort. Admiral Jim Ellis serves as the chair of that group. We're proud to have him here. And Admiral Ellis, you're recognized for a report on the work of the User Advisory Group. And join me in thanking Admiral Ellis for this latest chapter in his service to the United States. We're grateful to have you here.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President and distinguished members, thanks for inviting me to provide an update on the activities of the Users Advisory Group to your National Space Council. The UAG convened its first session on June 19th of this year, just 3 days after the formal appointment of its members by the NASA administrator. The establishment of the UAG was enabled by legislation enacted decades ago, but you chose to revitalize it after 25 years of dormancy. Mr. Vice President, when we were last together, you challenged the UAG to function as a think tank for the National Space Council, in addition to the advisory role spelled out in its title. It is a conduit for new ideas and will also offer constructive commentary on conventional wisdom, which, as I often note, is sometimes too conventional and not nearly wise enough. In the months since our inaugural session, we've gathered often through the wonders of modern telecommunications technology and have focused on 3 principal areas: organization, issues, and outreach. Organizationally, the UAG is divided into 6 committees that reflect precisely the priorities you and I discussed in your office last spring. The Exploration and Discovery Committee is led by retired General Lester Lyles, and it's considering how to maintain a balance in space between exploration and discovery, or science. The alignment of science and technology efforts across federal agencies, and the impact of regulations and policies on the accomplishment of Space Policy Directives 1 through 3. Administrator Bridenstine has recently chartered a committee of the NASA Advisory Council to review regulatory and policy issues. The fact that General Lyles also chairs very capably the NASA Advisory Council will ensure that the UAG both shares in the work of the NASA committee and offers independent advice to you when appropriate. As you know, I am the chairman of the National Security Committee of the Users Advisory Group and lead a very capable group with the required security clearances. Though many of us gathered in this room have been assessing national security, space, protection, and defense for many years, The speed at which the technologies and the threats are continually evolving highlights the reality that they may outpace both our capabilities and our policies. A scheduled threat update is our committee's first priority, followed up by a review of emerging classified space capability enhancement and threat mitigation policies and strategies. An experienced and expert space professional, Mary Lynn Dittmar, and her talented colleague Eric Stallmer chair the Economic Development and Industrial Base Committee. They are considering recommendations for accelerating the economic development of low Earth orbit and the Moon, developing a framework for understanding and applying the myriad contracting mechanisms, assessing how best to manage space-related spectrum issues, and expanding mechanisms encouraging use lease of available or mothballed government space infrastructure. Veteran astronaut and space shuttle pilot and mission commander Pam Melroy leads the Technology and Innovation Committee. In addition to specific space transportation and exploration technologies, the committee is assessing commercial versus government space data generation, satellite reusability and refueling, and importantly, the possible creation of a technology roadmap specifying space technologies to be explored, alternatives to be compared, and importantly, timelines that must be met. Eileen Collins, renowned four-time space shuttle pilot and mission commander, chairs the User Advisory Group Committee on Outreach and Education. I will say more about outreach efforts in a minute, but on the education side, our committee is committed to delivering actionable recommendations to enhance space-related and engineering education at all levels. Ideas include education incentive clauses in all space-related government contracts, incentivizing students to choose math, science, and engineering degrees by increasing individual grant money from existing programs, and innovative ways to address the high dropout rate of first-year engineering students. The final group, the Space Policy and International Engagement Committee, is led by Dr. David Wolf, astronaut, spacewalker, medical doctor, electrical engineer, and your fellow Hoosier. The committee's broad remit will include review of both the current and evolving national space policy, as well as the guidelines, behavioral norms, and technical standards affecting international space cooperation and deconfliction. Finally, as I noted earlier, mindful that we were impaneled to represent all users of space, the Users Advisory Group has conducted outreach panels at major domestic and international space events over several months. We will continue to seek input and ideas, issues and innovations, specifically targeting industry leadership, experienced aerospace veterans at all levels, and importantly, the up-and-coming new generation of space professionals. By way of example, Mary Lynn Dittmar and I met with a large group from the Space Generation Advisory Council earlier this month at the International Astronautical Congress in Bremen, Germany, where Administrator Bridenstine was also speaking powerfully. The SGAC, the Space Generation Advisory Council, with over 13,000 members, represents the largest network of students, young professionals, and alumni in the global space industry. In a note of appreciation I received after our session, the organization's executive director said, "The UAG is a perfect platform for us to provide an opportunity to our members to actively contribute to space-related activities and discussions." With that in mind, I'm also pleased to note that as of this past Friday, the Users Advisory Group has gone live with a hosted page under our NASA website where we can receive such input around the clock and from around the globe. Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the Users Advisory Group, thank you for this update opportunity. Wherever we go, at home or abroad, and with whomever we speak, we see a new energy, a new vitality in the space community. We appreciate the focus that you and the National Space Council have brought to our nation's role in space, and we look forward to continuing to support your efforts and to our shared contribution to the future of the nation's space enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Ellis, and we look forward to your recommendations from the User Advisory Group. Thank you to all of the members that you're leading in that energetic effort. We have benefited greatly from the Council's efforts so far, and we look forward to your ongoing advice. I am told there's a fair number of members of the User Advisory Group who are with us. Would members of the National Space Council's User Advisory Group stand so we could recognize you and express our appreciation for all you're doing for the country? Thank you, Admiral Ellis. And I'll invite our panelists to go ahead and take their seats. And to all of the members of the National Space Council, in your packets for today's meeting, you have an agenda which includes a formal testimony of our panelists, a list of recommendations to the President regarding the creation of the Space Force, which we will return to those items at the end of the meeting. Our panel today is made up of distinguished experts in national security, space policy, and defense policy. And as we look forward to offering recommendations today with the objective of standing up a sixth branch of our armed forces, it is our desire to draw on the experience of experts from across space and defense enterprises, and we have three with us today. Our first panelist is Doug Lavero, a leader in national security, space policy, and distinguished policy expert, served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Obama. Our second panelist is Mr. Mark Sarangelo, who is currently the Entrepreneur in Residence at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously served as Executive Vice President at Sierra Nevada Corporation, where he led the company's space business. And our final panelist is Lieutenant General James McLaughlin, a 35-year veteran of the United States Air Force, served as Deputy Commander of the United States Cyber Command. And as we move forward to standing up United States Space Command, we need to draw on the valuable lessons we've learned from establishing the United States Cyber Command already. So to all three of our panelists, we are grateful for your presence here today, and to the audience, join me in thanking this extraordinary group of Americans for joining us here today. So Mr. Doug Lavero, you're recognized to summarize your testimony, and I remind members of the Council that their full testimony is in your packets.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, members of the National Space Council, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, I must apologize for my voice here today. I lost it due to sickness this past week. My lack of volume is due to the remnants of fever, not the absence of fervor. I am pleased to join Lieutenant General McLaughlin and Mr. Sarangelo to provide my perspectives on the need for a U.S. Space Force, a discussion long overdue. I especially want to thank President Trump for moving the debate onto the national stage. This is not a new subject. It's been talked about for decades inside the national space community. During my time at the Pentagon under the last administration, the need to rethink how DoD reorganizes space or organizes for space was a topic of considerable debate, but was left unresolved. So I'm particularly grateful that with the President's help, we can now bring the discussion into the public square to educate all Americans on why now is the time to act. To begin, I think it's important for me to describe the roots of my perspective. My discussion here today was not shaped in just the last few months as the topic was thrust into the news, nor over my prior 4 years in the Pentagon leading space policy. Rather, it is the sum of nearly 30 years of working continuously in national security space from within DoD and the intelligence community, in uniform and as a civilian, from having been involved in every DoD space organizational debate since 1994, from working around the world with space-inclined allies and domestically with every segment of space industry, from large defense contractors to small entrepreneurial firms, and with members of both parties. I would stop on this last item to make an important point. In my mind, how the DoD organizes for space is not a partisan issue, and it is my hope that it does not become one, because if it does, and that causes us to fail to address it now, the next time we enter the discussion, U.S. leadership may have already been lost. With that as prelude, let me make it clear where I stand. The U.S. needs a Space Force, a a department within the DoD whose sole focus is U.S. leadership in and defense of the domain of space. Time does not permit me in this short statement to describe all the reasons why, but that opinion is bolstered by every authoritative study external to DoD over multiple decades which has looked at these issues. Every single one, points to the erosion of U.S. national security space leadership and the necessity to dramatically reorganize space within DoD. While they may differ on the exact form and timing of that reorganization, the unwavering consensus is that dramatic change is needed. In fact, even the Air Force Association, which opposes creation of a Space Force, admits, and I quote, "Standing up a new armed force for space is not if, but when." To that point, I think it's only appropriate to quote the words of General Hap Arnold, who founded the AFA and is viewed as the father of the modern Air Force. In his appearance before Congress in 1946 on the topic, he said, "Each new crisis has found our armed services far from effectively, efficiently, or economically organized. With each crisis, modernization and coordination have been hammered out under war pressure at great waste of resources. Last century's 2 world wars found the U.S. inadequately organized for the air domain. Luckily, the constraints of distance and speed in 1917 and 1941 allowed the U.S. to hammer out U.S. air power organization in time to respond. But General Arnold knew then, as we know now, that future wars will broker no such quarter. Historical limits on distance and speed do not apply in a world of hypersonic weapons and instantaneous worldwide communication. An unimaginable level of U.S. military power derives from space. We cannot afford to enter into the next conflict, to use General Arnold's words, ineffectively or inefficiently organized. The time to address the issue is now, while we are at peace, not later, when the adversary has already gained the upper hand. With that, I conclude my opening remarks and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Doug. I look forward to coming back with you with a couple of questions on your very, very insightful and provocative remarks. And thank you for braving the fever to share your fervor. We appreciate you making the effort to be here under the circumstances. Mark Cerangelo is recognized, and we're very grateful for your presence today. Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, members of the Space Council. I'm honored to be asked to speak today on the creation of the Space Force. What follows are my own personal views, not of any organization, and I have been part of. Over the past 2 decades, I've had the privilege to be part of and led organizations that have done over 300 space missions, which combined with the time that I've spent in the government, military, and industry associations, and now academia, has provided me with some unique insights into the creation of a Space Force. So I'm going to focus my remarks today on the why, but not the how. The United States is fortunate to have a storied space history. We have the most advanced space technologies, the largest space budgets, a commercial space sector that is innovating and investing, strong government leadership, universities and laboratories producing valuable primary results in research, and above all, talented people in and out of uniform who have created a space infrastructure that has no global equal. It was once famously said that it is in our DNA to do things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Being at the forefront of space leadership is hard. Testing new ideas and surviving through failure is hard. And as I've learned recently, teaching 100 students is really hard. Perhaps the hardest thing to do, though, sometimes is to be self-critical. We must be completely honest with ourselves in reviewing our decisions, both past and future. We must put aside the pride of ownership and self-interest and change when change is necessary. So here are a few frank views of my own on this situation. Yes, we are currently, as in the United States, at the forefront of space development, but there's no guarantee that we're going to remain in front. Our adversaries have been for a considerable time increasing their space resources on all levels. And to diminish this or dismiss their efforts as minor is really short-sighted. We cannot simply ignore this changing global environment, and we must use significant determination to accelerate our response. Undertaking the extraordinary effort of consolidating our national space defense activities under a common banner is one way to send a very blunt message to the world that we are serious. We as a nation achieve our best results when we are unified, when we are focused on the primary problem, when we're passionate in our responses, when we establish a competitive environment for solutions, and when we apply innovation not just to technology, but also to our thinking. We've seen this innovative thinking applied time and again in American aerospace. At the dawn of flight, the U.S. encouraged the development of an aviation industry and chose not to have government ownership of aviation, as did most other countries of the world. This led to us having aviation as one of the top economic pillars for the last 100 years. The lessons learned from World War II provided that air power should be one of the most important drivers of our national defense. This led to the creation of the U.S. Air Force in 1947. We responded to Sputnik and to losing ground in the space race by unifying ourselves around a complete transformation of our space efforts, leading not only to our celebrated journey to the moon, but also, as importantly, to the creation of our space industrial base, a strong NASA, and global recognition of our technical prowess. Recently, we've reacted to the shifting ways and means of space by encouraging a new commercial space sector focusing on public-private partnerships. This has allowed hundreds of American technologies to flourish and create beneficial competition throughout the country. Our reliance on space assets is growing exponentially in all ways. Its increasing importance to our country cannot be denied. This importance will not diminish and will only continue to expand. And the challenge we face is not going to become easier, it's not going to become cheaper, it's not going to become less complex or less important in the future. And at this crossroad, there is little to gain, in my view, from taking any middle position. We must do or not do. The question is not what's right for the next decade, but what's right for the next century. Those of us who work in the space sector really understand that what we do is really the long term, is for the long term, and we are only really just interim custodians for what happens here. What we do now and how we do it will vibrate well into the future. We have had significant success from our space structure. We owe a debt of gratitude to all those who sacrificed to get here. We owe it to them to use what they have used wisely. And our job as leaders is to hear all points of view and to have the wisdom and the judgment to come to informed and balanced decisions. As we go down this road of looking at a Space Force, this change must be more than just a paper reorg. It must be real, it must be fundamental, and it must be something that we can plan for the future. People often look at technology fields such as space and the industry that I've been in for the last 2 decades, and they look at the hardware and not really what's behind it. The reality is that we're only as good as the people we have on our front lines. We need to keep them engaged by creating strong career paths here. A dedicated Space Force will likely increase retention by creating more and more interesting long-term opportunities for high performers. We'll be able to attract the best and brightest in the future to the DoD if they see a robust long-term commitment being made by our government. And last and not least, the space is a large ecosystem. As we consider this change to be successful, we must look at elements beyond the DoD. We need to ensure that NASA remains strong, well-funded, and independent as our civil agency. We need to continue to support the U.S. commercial space industry's investment in technology. We need to incorporate our universities through the support of STEM education and future primary research. This will provide motivation to the next generations while pursuing space studies and concurrently increasing the future talent pipeline for the DoD. We need to fully utilize the substantial and critical work that's being done in our national laboratories. And finally, we need to remember that space is more international than ever before. When practical and feasible, we should cooperate with our allies. Multinational space activities have been successful for the U.S. in the past, and they will be in the future. I'd like to close. Sometimes, as I look at important decisions, one of the things that I like to do is to remember my trip to the National Archives. When you go up to the National Archives, as you walk through the door, there's a Shakespearean quote on a statue that says, "What is past is prologue." And with that quote, I'd like to end with just a little bit of walk into the past, if I may. In 1937, the Bible for aviation was called the Aircraft Yearbook. And there's a quote out of this that I think is very important and perhaps insightful for today. Most significant of all, in a situation that defies any sort of restraint in describing it, is the breakneck race of all other large nations for military supremacy in the air. The American people have taken real pride in the success which they have developed the airplane as a vehicle of peaceful transportation. They have always preferred that kind of development as compared to making the flying machine an instrument of war, and there's no indication that that national thought has changed. On the other hand, the present activity abroad is predominantly military and is growing so rapidly that it can no longer be ignored. Our adversaries are going into mass production of military aircraft as rapidly as facilities permit. Their factories are operating day and night. In the laboratories and drafting rooms, their scientists and technicians feverishly work on new things designed for aerial warfare. Many of these developments abroad seem fantastic and more of a stunt, but in aviation, the stunt flight of today seems bound to be commonplace tomorrow. The powers abroad are spending untold amount of money on research and development, but they are not just waiting for new things to be created. They're building quantities of these machines based on American aircraft operated in the United States. The laboratory work in progress surely will also result in much originality of design and construction. Therein lies the possible menace to American leadership. They are now making up for lost time. The United States is not spending enough money on fundamental research. While the superiority of American equipment is currently unquestioned at present, it is being challenged by the scientific efforts of other powers. Americans returning from abroad are convinced that the national thought as to safety from invasion must change. Whether or not the people in the United States like it or not, they must take care that foreign nations do not surpass them in the development of air power. If we substitute space for air, in those words from 1937, they're just as valid today as they were then. We know what happened to the world a few years after that all happened. We must use all possible efforts to avoid it. Does not happen again. Thank you for letting me address the council.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for those eloquent words. We look forward to coming back to you with some questions with that. The former Deputy Commander of the United States Cyber Command, Lieutenant General James McLaughlin, is recognized. Thank you, General.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Vice President Pence, members of the National Space Council, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to join these two distinguished panelists to discuss the President's proposal to create a Space Force. I have a unique perspective on the topic of how the government should organize and manage national security space. You can see from my biography that I spent the majority of my 34-year career in a variety of space assignments that are relative to today's discussion. I resonated with your opening comments. I'm very proud of my service in the Air Force and what our service has done and the legacy we have in space. But my perspective today really is on the challenges that are now and some of the challenges that have been on our plate going back to the time of the Rumsfeld Space Commission, where I served as a staff member and was later responsible within the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Space Commission implementation to the Deputy Secretary of Defense. I have firsthand knowledge of what the Commission recommended and why, as well as what was and what was not implemented. I'm here representing myself and have no personal or business interest in the outcome of this debate other than wanting what's best for the United States. The Space Commission was tasked, among other things, to assess the potential costs and benefits of establishing a separate military department for space, a Space Corps within the United States Air Force, and an Assistant Secretary of Defense for space within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. However, after 6 months of deliberations, the Commission did not recommend an immediate move toward a department or a corps, but instead recommended an internal Air Force realignment aimed at creating a separate structure within the Air Force, with control over space, organized, trained, and equipped functions such as personnel management and policy, financial management, research and development, and the planning, programming, and acquisition of space systems. The Commission stated that once the realignment in the Air Force was complete, a logical step towards a Space Department could be the transition to a Space Corps within the Air Force. The Commission also recommended the creation of a new Undersecretary of Defense for Space that would actually oversee and advocate for this missionary within the department. So what happened and where are we today? I'm disappointed to say that we missed a generational opportunity. We did not implement the realignment of the Air Force as envisioned by the Space Commission, and we did not create a strong OSD oversight mechanism. We never started the journey towards a corps or a department. We missed the opportunity identified by the Commission to, quote, create a space-oriented culture comprised of military professionals who would directly influence the development of the systems and doctrines for use in space operations, end quote. While it would be untrue and unfair to say we've not made progress in national security